Konnichiwa. Today, we're going to look at something that is important in itself, but also throws light on some of the subtleties of Japanese that are very useful to know as we go forward into deeper immersion. So what we're going to look at is 4 different ways of saying something that in English are all covered by the one word, open. Now, these are akeru, hiraku, hirakeru. Now, when we look at these at first, they look like 2 self-move, other-move pairs, don't they? And after a point, they are. But what this is going to illustrate is something of the subtlety of the whole self-move, other-move concept in Japanese, as opposed to the much more technical and clear-cut contrast between transitivity and intransitivity in English and other Western languages. So if you're not familiar with the concept of self-move and other-move verbs, what in the West tend to get called transitive and intransitive verbs, I'll put a link to my video on that subject above my head and in the comments below. The second thing we notice is that when you write them with kanji, you can't actually see the difference between akeru and hiraku, hirakeru. Now this is partly because they are actually interchangeable in many cases, and on the whole, if it's not a case when it needs to be hiraku, hirakeru, people will generally read haitu, akeru. But if a writer wants to specify that she's using hiraku for a particular function, we'll look at some of those effects a little later. She will write it in hiragana to make the matter clear. Right, so first let's take the top 2, akeru, akeru. Akeru is self-move, akeru is other move. They both mean open. So, akeru, door opens, a bottle opens, hacharu, open a door, open a bottle. That at least is the theory. In practice, we will often hear Japanese people say things like meo aku, open one's eyes, which is technically incorrect in the eyes of the grammarians because akeru is self-move and they're using it in an other-move way, open one's eyes. Now, I'm somewhat challenging the grammarians here, and I'll tell you why in a moment, but you should stick to the actual grammatical model because there are only a limited number of instances in which Japanese people do use akeru transitively, and I'm using the word transitively deliberately here. You'll see why in a moment. And you don't want to be memorizing which those are. If you use akeru as the other move version, opening your mouth, opening the door, opening anything, you'll never go wrong. That's always correct. So why am I challenging this official view that akeru ought to be intransitive? Well, I've got a slight feeling here that Japanese grammarians are a little bit influenced by Western thinking and by the Western concepts of transitivity and intransitivity. When Japanese people say meo active, I believe the instinct or the feeling behind it is that opening one's eyes is toward the arrow side of the aru suru map that we talked about in my transitivity lasso. In other words, opening one's eyes is closer to being self-move, closer to being than doing, as opposed to opening the door, opening a bottle, or some other external object. Now that's my take on this, and you can ignore it if you want to, but we'll get onto some more of these subtleties, which are not disputed by anybody, as we go forward. So now, let's look at the difference between akeru and hiraku. They both mean open. Akeru is, officially speaking, self-move, although we can see that there's a little bit of leeway here. Hiraku is both self-move and other-move quite formally. The difference between them has nothing to do with self-move or other-move, it has to do with the kind of opening that we're talking about. So if we talk about opening a bottle, taking the lid off a box, anything like that, it's definitely akeru. On the other hand, if we talk about a flower opening, it's definitely hiraku. So something that unfolds, opens out, is hiraku. Something that simply becomes open instead of closed is akeru. And if you like Japanese children's songs, you may well have heard the hand game song that goes Musunde hiraite te orte musunde. Musunde is musubu, which means scattered or joined, and that refers to a closed hand. Hiraite refers to a hand that's spread out like an open flower. There are various areas where these two are interchangeable, but even when they're interchangeable, they stress one aspect rather than another. So, for example, the French door, ton, akeru, open, or hiraku, spread open. Eyes generally akeru, but they can be set to hiraku. And when we use hiraku instead of akeru in these cases, it's rather like in a movie when you zoom in on someone's eyes slowly becoming open, or on doors slowly spreading open. There's more sense of the actual process of the opening of the spreading out. So this gives a subtlety that we don't have in English that can be infused into speech or writing just by choosing hiraku instead of akeru. Now let me come to more metaphorical or abstract uses. The distinction is important again. For example, we can say mise o akeru or mise o hiraku. And they both mean open a shop. But mise o akeru implies simply opening in the morning for business, or opening after the lunch break, or something like that. Simply literally opening the shop, just opening the doors so the customers can come in. Mise o hiraku implies opening a shop for the first time, opening to the public. In other words, spreading out like a flower, changing from something that was closed into something that's open. And just a side note here, with an umbrella, which also spreads out, and you might be inclined to say hiraku, you don't usually use that. It's generally sasu, or opening an umbrella. Now what about hirakeru? The Japanese grammarians, or at least many of them, actually designate hirakeru as the self-move version of hiraku. But that doesn't really make any sense, because hiraku itself is both self-move and other move. So what's actually going on here? This is quite interesting. Hiraku, which can be either self-move or other move, is further over to the suru side of the map than hirakeru. And what do I mean by that? Well, I did a video a while ago about what I call untranslatable Japanese. And this is about Japanese verbs that really can't be reproduced in English because they express states rather than actions in a way that just doesn't happen in English. A very simple and common example is wakaru, which is often translated by English dictionaries and textbooks as understand. It certainly doesn't mean understand. But when you get a better translation, that will tend to be understandable or be clear. And that's much closer to what wakaru actually means, but the real meaning can't be translated into English because it's actually not an adjective like clear or understandable. It's a verb. So what we're really saying is do understandable, do the act of understandability, and this just doesn't have an English translation. And there are lots of stative verbs like this, and I talked about them in the video. And hirakeru really comes closer to being one of these. Nureru, which is often translated as become wet, but it doesn't actually mean become wet. It can include that, but implies existing in the state of being wet. It may mean become wet and then continue to be wet, or it can just mean be wet, but of course it isn't be wet, it's in fact do wet, which isn't translatable into English. The same with hirakeru. So it's used in cases like, for example, you often say unga hirakeru, which means one's luck opens. Now, we could say unga hiraku, and that would mean one's luck unfolds like a flower, becomes open. But hirakeru implies not just unfolding, but continuing to exist in that state of unfoldedness. The reason we would be more prone to saying nise o hiraku is partly because it's more othermu than hirakeru, and we're actually doing it to the shop we're opening it. Also because stress is on this act of opening the shop. Unga hirakeru, the stress on the actual opening of the lock is less important than the fact that it's going to change. From then on, we're going to be lucky, whereas at the moment we're not so lucky. So I think this gives us a view not only of the 4 words for opening in Japanese and how they work, how they interplay. A lot of the time they overlap with each other and it doesn't matter too much which one you use. In some cases it really is important. Either for what you're specifically saying, though for the nuance and implication and atmosphere that you want to build by saying it. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels, who make these videos possible, and all my other producer angels, my supporters on Patreon and everywhere, and all of you who help this revolution in Japanese to continue month by month, week by week. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.